Shalom, people of God. We want to thank God this day that He has given to us. We are coming to us on Family Altar Forum 200, and the title is Israel, Rejection of Being Peculiar. Rejection of Being Peculiar. Today we would want to read 1 Samuel chapter 8, the whole of it, and then we will do some observation thereafter. Let's go to 1 Samuel chapter 8. When Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons as judges for Israel. The name of the first was Joel, and the name of the second was Abijah. And they served at Beersheba. But his sons did not walk in his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain, and accepted bribes, and perverted justice. We know that Samuel was a good judge, but he appointed his own sons, but they were not able to maintain the good judgment that he was. And that's a danger of succession. At times successors would not do as the predecessor, but that is a lesson for another day. So we need to be careful about who succeeds in the things that we do. So all the elders, verse 4, of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. They said to him, "You are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have." Note that they proposed that they would have a king to lead them, that they may be like other nations, and not to maintain the peculiarity, uniqueness that God had given to them. You remember in the previous podcast, we looked at how God had selected and appointed Israel as a nation and removed them from the bondage of Egyptians and given them freedom, though they were in the wilderness for 40 years. But thereafter, they got into the land of Canaan through the leadership of Joshua, as stipulated in Joshua 1, and then the division of the land is in Joshua chapter 14. So you see, this nation had been called out from other nations by God. God wanted them to be a kingdom of priests. God wanted them to be a holy nation. God wanted them to be his peculiar treasure. But they abrogate all that, and they say they don't want to have that uniqueness. They just want to be like any other. And that is a caution for us believers. God has called us to be unique, but at times we want to compromise. We want to be like anybody else. We want to be to do things like everyone else is doing things, and we may lose the treasured position that God has given to us. Even as ministries, we need to be careful. We need to know what uniqueness has God given us, because God does not call us to be like everybody else. God calls us with a special calling, and if it was not, then he had not called us. But God calls us because he has a unique work that he wants us to do. But we want to compromise the uniqueness and be like every Tom, Dick, and Harry. I think it is important for us to know our uniqueness and maintain that. And when we do that, we'll be blessed by God. So we see Israel here abrogating the position that had been given to them by God, being priests that will come between God and other nations, and will come between other nations and God to show them the way. But they refuse to do that. Verse 6 says, "But when they said, 'Give us a king to lead us,' this displeased Samuel. So he prayed to the Lord." You can see Samuel was displeased because of the proposition of the children of Israel, and he resorted to prayer. When you are displeased of anything, pray, and God will lead you. God will guide you. God will convince and convict you on what you should do. And once he has done that, don't care about what other people say. Just care about what God says and the way that he leads you. Go through the way that he wants you to go, and he will bless you. Verse 7, and the Lord told him, listen to all that the people are saying to you. It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king. There you are. They were rejecting God. They were dethroning God, even without knowing. And many times we have seen in history, people reject God by proposing so and so and raising so and so, and then eventually they end up in problems. We must not dethrone God. We must not dethrone Jesus Christ. He must be the center, not any man, not any woman, not any leader. It must be Christ who is the center of the things that we do. Man should be very far from the center. It is only Christ who must sit in our hearts. It is Christ who must rule our hearts, and not any woman or not any man or not any institution. We must be careful not to reject God, but we can reject God by the way we handle our affairs. Verse 8 says, and they have done from the day I brought them up out of Egypt unto this day, forsaking me and serving other gods. So they are doing to you. That's what they had been. That's the testimony that God had for them, that they were forsaking him as they had done previously and served other gods. We need to be careful not to focus on other things other than God. God must be the object of our worship and service. Verse 9 says, now listen to them, but warn them solemnly, and let them know what the king who will reign over them will do. Now we need to psychoanalyze this, that God is telling Samuel to warn them of the kind of the king that they are proposing to have. And this is what he will do. Now we need to analyze this in our context. Verse 10 says, Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. He said, this is what the king who will reign over you will do. And I would like us to have a spin peek on this and see what is happening right here. He will take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses. Right? You can see already there. There is a motorcade there. There is protocols that are proposed right here. That the sons will be taken to serve the king with chariots and horses. They will run in front of his chariots, even like we have seen in our leaders, that they have people, they have motorcade, they have escort, they have ushers here and there. They have all this, you see it. It began at the time of King Saul, that they will run in front of his chariots, escorts. Some he will assign to be commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and others to plow his ground and reap his harvest. He was to engage them in his personal business, agricultural business right here. They were to be diggers, and they were to be reapers of his harvest, and still others to make weapons of war and equipment. Others were to make weapons of war and other equipments for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He was to engage their children, right, in his own agenda, in his own vision, in his own businesses. Maybe he was having bakery and he was to engage them in that. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves and give them to his attendants. He was to get things from people and give them to the people that were serving him directly. He will take a tenth of your grain and of your vintage and give it to his officials and attendants. He was to get things from people and then give them to the people that he chose, even without any criteria, even without any orthodox way of doing that. And this is happening with our leaders today. It is really happening. We just need to open our eyes and see this spirit is still with us today, many years after it happened with Saul. Verse 16, your men servants and maid servants and the best of your cattle and donkeys, he will take for his own use. He will take a tenth of your flocks, and yourselves will become his slaves. He would enslave them. He would get things that tie them around him. They would not have the freedom that God intended them to have, because man does not give freedom. Man gives bondage. No man gives freedom. It is only God who can give freedom. It's only Christ who can give freedom. A fellow man, a fellow woman, a fellow leader will not give you freedom. Sad to say. Sarah. Verse 18. When that day comes, you will cry out for relief from the king you have chosen, and the Lord will not answer you in that day. If we enthrone a man or a woman, it will come to a time when you will want to be delivered. You cry to God, but God may not deliver you when you think he ought to deliver you. So we have to be careful not to enslave ourselves. But the people refused to listen to Samuel, verse 19. No, they said, we want a king over us. Then we will be like other nations, with a king to lead us and to go out before us and fight our battles. Yeah, we think they will come there and they will lead us well and they will fight our battles. And little will we know that that was not so. It was for their own gain. Man is greedy inherently. Man is selfish inherently. Man wants to have self-interest inherently. And this is what Saul became over Israel. Verse 21. When Samuel heard all that the people had said, he repeated it before the Lord. And the Lord answered, listen to them and give them a king. Then Samuel said to the men of Israel, everyone go back to his own town. So, brethren, we can see what happened to the children of Israel. They had been called of God to be a unique people, but they rejected to be a unique nation. They just wanted to be like the nations from which they had been called by God. So we need to be careful. God's promise to Abraham contained the three elements which would be realized in Israel history. Those elements, the reality of descendants, and a covenant relationship, and the inheritance of the land, also were factors in realization of God's purpose for the nation of Israel. Therefore, God was dealing with all nations, but later he did focus on Israel to be an example to others. In connection With that, staying 24 asserts that God narrowed his focus from all nations to one nation. The Old Testament began with a cross-section of nations as God in judgment scattered the people across the face of the earth. Out of all the nations, God selected one nation to be a model of the purpose in their midst, and this was the nation of Israel. But we have sadly seen that Israel was indifferent to the fate of those who did not know God. She never volunteered to go after them. Jesus coming to Israel was consistent with God's covenant to Abraham, as Abraham was raised up in order to reach all nations. So Christ coming in and through Israel of his day was for the sake of the nations. So because Israel failed to be a sample nation that God intended had to be, God eventually had to bring Christ. And that is why we talk about Christ today. That is why Christ came to fulfill the same promise that God had given to Israel. Israel abrogated. Israel refused to be used of God, and God sidelined Israel, and he brought one of her seed, and that is the Lord Jesus Christ, so that the promise of Abraham of being unique will be fulfilled. In Galatians chapter 3 and verse 16 says, Galatians 3 and verse 16, it says, the promises were spoken to Abraham and to his seed. The scripture does not say two seeds, meaning many people, but